What's up, Goober? Pro CS2 players do not hold angles, most of the time. I watched and recorded juicy data from 3 pro players' FACEIT games, Kyosuke, Donk, and Elige. This data captures 12 games, over 300 kills, and over 150 deaths total. Initially, I wanted to revisit their crouching habits like I did in this video, but the more I watched, the more I realized these guys are always swinging. This isn't a new observation at all, but when I narrowed my focus into when these insanely good players swing versus hold, I found a lot of things to learn from. I then wanted to look even closer, so I focused on how these players hold angles. Are they crouching? Are they moving? Are they static? Etc. So let's dive into how pro players hold angles and how you can copy them right after a word from SteelSeries Sonar. Hey you, do you ever struggle in some games because you just can't hear your enemies coming? Well, I've got the perfect solution for you. SteelSeries Sonar, a completely free audio software that can give you a real edge in CS2. With its wide range of presets developed in collaboration with game studios and pro players, you can now get the best audio settings to hear your opponent's footsteps with just one click. Thanks to the independent audio control feature, you can find the perfect balance between your game sounds, your music, and your friends' voices on Discord. And the best part? It works with any headset and any microphone. Wait, microphone? Yes, with Sonar, you can turn your headset microphone into a clean, crisp, and pleasant sounding microphone. So don't wait any longer. To gain a real advantage over your opponents, download SteelSeries Sonar using my link in the description. And as a bonus, you can use my code Wilson20 to get 20% off the entire SteelSeries website. Let's start with a very important question. How often do pro players peek versus hold an angle? To answer this question, we need data. I only took data from rounds where they either had an upgraded pistol, an SMG, or a rifle. Op rounds were excluded along with full ecos unless something interesting happened. Within this data, there were 5 types of kills or deaths that I recorded. Swings and holds. Sometimes differentiating the two could be difficult, but it's somewhat of a you know it when you see it thing. The most important aspect I focused on to differentiate the two is who initiated the timing of the fight. So a player could be holding an angle and then they swing out to get a kill. This would be classified as a swing rather than a hold because they dictated the timing of the fight. There were also scale holds, which is a very underrated aspect of Counter-Strike and one that Donk is really good at. This is when you're taking space or you're moving from point A to point B and you have to be ready for people to peek you or for you to expose yourself to a ton of new angles at once. These could be difficult to distinguish between swings, but often they would be associated with diagonal movement or moments where the player is obviously taking space or repositioning. Another type of kill or death that I recorded was a mutual swing. This is where both players swing an angle at about the same timing. Situations where neither player has a clear advantage due to the similar timing and speeds of their swings. And lastly, completely non-applicable kills or deaths. These were where they neither swung nor they held an angle. These were kills through smokes, dying to someone behind them, util kills, etc. So to get a good idea of how often these players would try to dictate the timings of their fights, I combined the total times they got a kill or died while swinging, doing a scaling hold, or a mutual swing. I was shocked, to be honest, because they all had extremely similar percentages. So get this. All 3 would initiate a fight within a percent point of 73% of the time. So within all of their kills and deaths, 73% of them were fights initiated by them. An interesting note here is that Donk only swung 53% of the time compared to Kyosuke and Elige, who were both right around 60%. The reason for this is that Donk had significantly more scale holds, that being 16.3% of his total kills and deaths. This was often due to how aggressive his playstyle is and how often his teams would just rush sites in these pugs. He was also super kill hungry, so there were many instances of him just like hunting players running around like in this clip. So if they all initiated fights at about 73% of the time, this means that they all held angles at incredibly similar rates as well, with all 3 being within a percent point of 27%. So what's going on here? Well, peeking is good. If we narrow the data down to exclude deaths and only look at kills, then we see very similar rates in terms of swinging, where 59% of Kyosuke's kills came from peeking and 56% for Elige and Donk. Keep in mind this excludes mutual swings and excludes scale holds. For holding angles, it was about 27% of their kills for all 3 players. So how is it possible that these players get twice as many kills peeking as they do holding? Firstly, we have to acknowledge that this data comes from pugs, where it is incredibly rare for there to be a better player in the server than one of these three. Thus, they're more likely to play aggressively, meaning more peeking and less holding. Number 2, peeker's advantage. But not just in terms of the server side preference for peeking, but for other more human reasons too. The peeker gets to dictate the timing of the fight, giving them the advantage of knowing exactly when the fight will occur. The peeker is also typically moving faster than the holder, making the shot more difficult to hit for the holding player. Thirdly, counter swinging. Let's focus on this briefly because holy crap did they do it a lot, and man is it important and good and awesome and cool. Counter swinging is a term used to describe swinging someone who is swinging you. This is so strong because by counter swinging you are forcing the fight against your opponent before they expect it. You are moving when you enter their screen and you are swinging past their crosshair, forcing them to flick. Because of these strengths of peeking, Kyosuke, Elige, and Donk would constantly turn situations that would appear to be a hold into a swing. They would swing off of sound cues, they would time out peaks on angles, or just repeatedly swing an angle instead of holding it. I want to make it clear that both the data and the demos scream the fact that swinging and thus dictating the timing of fights was the default go-to option for these players. Okay, so if peeking is so good, then when should you hold angles? This is a really tricky question to answer because it is so nuanced. However, there are some pretty consistent types of situations where these players would allow their opponents to peek into them. Number 1, when they had a significant positional advantage. Common positional advantages would look like off angles that their opponents are unlikely to clear, hitting a good timing to hold an unexpected angle, or playing a crossfire with a teammate. Secondly, they would hold angles when they had some sort of gun advantage. Thirdly, they would hold an angle when they would be the contact player in a contact setup. Fourthly, they would often hold angles when they want to take one shot and then fall back. A reoccurring theme in the data is that these players would get a lot of kills holding angles while having a deagle. I didn't count op rounds, but it would be a similar trend. And lastly, when they had to. Sometimes you're just going to get swung on, sometimes pros are just going to get swung on, sometimes you just have to hold an angle. Something very funny to come out of this data is that when we consider all three players' kills and deaths, they had a combined KD of 1.67 while initiating fights, and a 3.0 KD when holding angles. I do not think in any way this means that holding angles is better than swinging. In fact, especially after watching every single one of these kills, I think it means the opposite. In the vast majority of situations where these players got a kill while holding an angle, they had some sort of significant advantage like the ones previously listed. So when they already have some sort of significant advantage, they would hold an angle, but by default, they would try to peek. Now, I wasn't happy with just looking at how often these players held angles. I also wanted to know how they held angles in regard to their movement. So I classified the different ways these three players moved or didn't move while holding an angle to 7 types of holds. I also recorded how often they did every type of movement and whether they were holding an on angle or an off angle along with other context for the situation. Now keep in mind that the sample size for this is pretty small since we're already filtering a small sample size just to when they're holding angles. The first type of hold I looked at were static crouches. Of the 3 players I looked at, Elige did static crouch holds the most, with about 22% of his holds being a static crouch. These were almost always on angles or when they had an opponent pinned into a corner. Kyosuke and Donk didn't do this as much, but they would do it for the most part in very similar situations. The second type of hold was a static standing hold. Aside from shift walking, this was the least used type of movement or lack thereof while holding holding an angle, with only 10 instances of it happening total. These were really only used in situations where either they had a deagle and wanted to take one shot and get out, or they had a huge positional advantage, or in this round where Donk wants to force a headshot angle fight while he's low HP. The third and fourth ways these pros moved while holding an angle were incredibly similar, so I'm just going to loop them in together. The third way is silent strafes with no counter strafes, and the fourth is the same but with counter strafes. So silent strafes with no counter strafes look like this. It's pretty bouncy, boing boing boing, back and forth, whereas with counter strafes it looks more like this, where it's a bit cleaner and maybe a little bit slower. Kyosuke had a very clear preference and habit for this kind of bouncing around while holding an angle without counter strafing, doing this about 40% of the time he held an angle. Donk did this about 36% of the time, and Elige did this only about 22% of the time. Elige had a greater tendency to counter strafe while holding angles rather than doing these bouncy back and forth holds. Keep in mind that while doing this, when these players got peaked, they would almost always react to the peak with some sort of movement. A strafe out, a crouch tap, a donk slide, etc. These two types of holds combined were by far the most popular and most common, accounting for nearly 50% of the total holds I recorded. These mini strafes weren't done in any super specific situations, but more so as the go-to way to hold an angle silently, regardless of if it's an on angle or an off angle. The fifth type of hold were loud, wide strafes. One thing you'll see Donk do a lot when he's holding an angle are big wide strafes back and forth. This makes it so that when you're getting peaked, you are likely not on a real angle, forcing a flick from your opponent, and you're likely moving at full speed, making you harder to hit. However, for this to work best, you have to be kind of far enough away from the angle for your opponents to not hear you, and you also have to hope that only one person peeks you because you are out in the open and very tradable. The sixth type of hold was a crouch walk hold. Crouch walking while holding an angle didn't occur all too much. The most common way I saw them use it was to create an off angle. Take this round from Kyosuke, for example. However, crouch walking was used a ton when these players had to do a scale hold, when they had to move from point A to point B, but they could be peaked at any moment. Crouch walking is really good for that because you're fully accurate while you're crouch walking. And lastly, shift walking. Shift walking while holding an angle is bad. This really only occurred 3 times, and all 3 were in situations where the pro was in an incredibly advantageous situation. I'd like to remind you that this is a super inexact science, and my data is influenced heavily by my subjective opinions. I recorded data over a few days, and maybe one day I would classify something differently than I would the next day, you know? So it's very unscientific. It's very much just like, what does Wilson think? But I think it's still super interesting and fun to create data out of something so nuanced as this. It's really just to get a general sense of what these players are doing and how they're doing it. But with this data, I could still confidently conclude 3 things. Number 1, initiating the timing of fights is incredibly important. Many of these players' deaths came from swinging, not seeing somebody, and then the other player initiating the timing of the fight. Being the peaker is just so strong. Number 2, when you don't have some sort of advantage in holding an angle, turn that hold into a swing if you can. In inherently defensive situations, all 3 players would constantly do whatever they can to still be the initiator of gunfights. And number 3, when you do have some sort of advantage in holding an angle, you should be moving while holding that angle about 70 to 90% of the time. Being hard to hit with your movement is crucial to being good at Counter-Strike. Goober, if you have any thoughts, please drop a comment. I would love to read them, and hopefully I can respond to all of them. Also, like the video, and please subscribe if you enjoy my content. Do it right now. Okay, thank you. Shout out to my channel members here on YouTube. They help support me and allow me to be a goober on the internet. Please consider becoming one. Check out my other videos too, and have a great day. Peace out.